Hello, everyone. Today, myself and my co-presenter will be presenting about examining the impact of assessment formats on vocabulary learning. My name is Barry Kavanagh. I'm from Tokyo University, and my co-presenter is...
Kazuyo Koide from Tokyo University of the Arts.
Okay, great. So thank you and welcome to our presentation. So let's begin. So this is an outline of what we'll be talking about today. So we will go from background to literature review, talk about the study we did, and then results in discussion, and then offer some conclusions. So the study focus of what we looked at was looking at teaching and understanding synonyms within the context of TOEFL reading passages. And we also wanted to look at the impact of assessment formats on synonym acquisition. So for Japanese English language learners, vocabulary can be very, very difficult, especially when we look at the high school level and university level. So at high school, they do English for academic purposes, but when they get to university level, lots of vocabulary which they don't know, which is very, very difficult for them to catch up and learn. So there's discrepancy between what they learn at high school and university level is quite large. So this means that doing the TOEFL test can be quite difficult, and the vocabulary and synonyms within the reading passages of the TOEFL test is quite difficult for them. So if we look at the literature review, most of it suggests that vocabulary recognition, like multiple choice tests, are a lot easier than production testing. For example, gap filling, where students have to actually write the missing word. So there is a hierarchy of vocabulary knowledge difficulty, with multiple choice being easier than recall production like gap fill tasks. Also, we wanted to look at vocabulary retention after a delayed period. So different types of exercises affect long-term vocabulary retention. For example, we have the forgetting curve, and this suggests that productive knowledge, where students have to write words, spell words, is particularly vulnerable to decay. So if they don't study it and there's a delayment of time, there can be a significant decline in their productive knowledge of the vocabulary which they have learned. So the research questions. We wanted to look at number one, what are students' vocabulary learning beliefs, study habits, and learning strategies for synonyms? Two, do students do better with synonym vocabulary quizzes in the multiple choice or fill in the blank gap fill test formats? Three, what preferences do students have for vocabulary, multiple choice or fill in the gap fill test formats? And number four, what impact does integration of recognition-based and production-based quizzes have on short-term and long-term retention of vocabulary in Japanese EFL students? Okay, so now we will talk about research methods. So over to my co-host.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kavanagh. The first, it's about our participants. We had 146 participants from two national universities. Students in both classes used the TOEFL materials. Tohoku University students take the TOEFL ITP test in April and December. Other students are planning to take TOEFL IBT to study abroad. Their English level is upper intermediate around B1 to B2. The next slide shows the flow of our data collection. The study was conducted from October 2024 to January 2025, and it includes two important data sets. The core of this data collection, highlighted in orange on this slide, is the participant score changes on the pre- and post-reading quizzes during the TOEFL mini reading lessons, and also the delayed post-tests. These quizzes were designed to assess participants' understanding of the target vocabulary and its synonyms, and to compare how they performed across two test formats, the multiple choice and written gap fill. In particular, the post-delayed test aims to evaluate long-term vocabulary retention. We also looked at the patterns in the student written responses in their language use in the post-reading and the delayed post-test, which gave us further insights to students' vocabulary production. The second important data set, highlighted in lime green on the slide, that is the survey. To investigate the participant vocabulary learning beliefs, learning strategies, and study habits, we conducted a survey with an 11-item, 6-point Likert scale, ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and 4-point Likert scale, asking about the frequency of synonym use. We also conducted 2 open-ended questions about how they study vocabulary and what study tools they use. In addition, we administered the same 11-item survey after the series of quizzes to see whether how they test-taking experiences influenced learning beliefs. This was followed by 1 open-ended question asking about reasons for preferred test formats, multiple choice, or written gap fill. In the next slide, I will explain the reading passages we used in the mini TOEFL reading lessons. Students had a chance to learn various topics during the mini TOEFL reading lessons. As the topics are shown in this slide: the birds, the expression of emotions, galaxy and geology, and landscape. These are all from the TOEFL Offshore Guide. In each reading passage, there are around 10 questions. All passages have a few synonym questions to examine test takers' vocabulary knowledge in the passage. They need to understand not only the meaning of the target word in the content, but also need to know what the appropriate synonym of the word is. The next slide introduces mini TOEFL reading lesson. This is a flow of how we conducted the mini TOEFL reading lesson. In every class, we started with a warm-up session, and the instructor of both classes asked the same questions, like, what do you think target word A means? This 2 to 3 minutes warm-up session gave students to be exposed to the target word and its synonyms. Some students quickly looked at the words in the online dictionary and discussed to their partner. Then they took a pre-reading quiz, which was given through Google Forms. It was multiple choice question. After that, students took 1 TOEFL reading test. This test was also conducted on Google Forms. Finally, they took the synonym quiz again, this time using a gap fill format. Students typed the target word in the Google Forms. In the following slide, I will show you the example of multiple choice question and the gap fill question that students answered in the pre- and post-reading quizzes. Here are the quiz examples. On the left side, there is a multiple choice question, and on the right side, a gap fill. In both types, students worked with synonym words. Now, let's move on to the survey results that tell us about student vocabulary learning. First, this is our first research question we focus on, the following survey results to answer this question. These 11 questions were asked to investigate how students perceived their vocabulary learning process and their beliefs about different vocabulary learning strategies during TOEFL reading test preparation. The same questions were asked again after the delayed post-test to see if experiencing the series of vocabulary quiz influenced their beliefs. The result of our statistical analysis indicates that there were no statistically significant differences between the pre-survey and the post-survey. However, we observed a slight changes highlighted in red and yellow in this table. Overall, the result suggests that mini TOEFL lessons didn't cause any measurable change in the student beliefs or about vocabulary learning strategies. As you see, this shows what kind of tools they use to look up word meanings. Google is the most commonly used tool. These students are digital natives. They are familiar with using online tools. Very few students used online dictionaries. Next, let's take a closer look at their learning habits. This slide shows students' study habits. When they practice TOEFL reading exercises for homework, around 70% of them check the synonym either occasionally or sometimes when doing their TOEFL reading homework. 27% never checked, and just 4% said they always looked up synonyms. To wrap up, participants preparing for TOEFL reading tests highly valued vocabulary expansion to improve their reading skills. They also recognize the benefits of learning new words through reading passages. Although there are few synonym questions in the every TOEFL reading section, only 4% of students reported having a routine of looking up synonyms. The survey results suggest that synonym learning is not a widely adapted strategy among participants. Even though students recognize the benefit of learning vocabulary through reading, their beliefs and strategies around synonym learning stays the same, even after practicing synonym learning through the quizzes. Next, Dr. Kavanagh presents the quiz results.
Okay, great. Thank you. So now I'll talk about the pre and post reading quiz results. Okay, so just to remind ourselves of the questions, so do students do better in synonym vocabulary quizzes with a multiple choice or fill in the gap? And what do students prefer, multiple choice or fill in the gap quizzes? So if we look at the next slide and the results, so as you can see, here we have the passages from 1 to 4, and there were significant differences in the scores when we compare the multiple choice mean scores and the gap fill scores. So even though students did incredibly well in both sets of quizzes, there were significant differences, meaning they did perform better in the multiple choice than in the gap fill. And then we asked students, which quiz do you actually prefer, multiple choice or gap fill? Interestingly, over half of the students preferred gap fill quizzes, and only a quarter preferred multiple choice, with the other quarter thinking both were equally fine. So if we look at reasons why, the next slide, so preferences for multiple choice. Some students said having choices helps me recall words. Typing answers is too hard in the gap fill and they might lose my motivation. Exposure to more words. So with multiple choice, you have options, you have exposure to more words. Better for early learning. And also, because the TOEFL test has multiple choice, why not do multiple choice when we practice the TOEFL test? However, why did students prefer gap fill? Many students mentioned that it helps their spelling. Typing forces me to remember spelling correctly. They get a better and deeper understanding of the words. Also, they can retain the words. If they type them out, perhaps it will stick in their memory better. So basically, there's higher cognitive reinforcement through doing gap fill exercises. So if we look at the next slide, so basically these findings, we found that synonym recognition and production in both the pre and post TOEFL quizzes, the multiple choice and a gap fill, students did very, very well in them. When we look at the errors, the gap fill errors, it wasn't that they didn't know the word. Most of the reasons why they got it wrong was because of spelling or sometimes grammatical challenges. They had to change the tense of the word or the formation of the word. So this leads us to conclude that multiple choice has a lower cognitive demand and you get better performance outcomes, whereas gap fill tasks, cognitively, they are more challenging. and it requires lexical to syntactic processing, for example, the grammatical tense or word formation. So if we look at the next slide and we look at the unannounced delayed post-test results, which we did. So we told the students that we were doing a test, and we did a test 5 weeks after reading passage 4. And we wanted to look at the impact that the gap fill quizzes have on short-term retention and long-term retention. So if you look at the next slide, so as we can see, the passage gap fill scores roughly had an average of 80-something% in each of them. But when we look at the delayed post-test, which was done 5 weeks after, there's a dramatic drop to 38 or 39%. So nearly half. It dropped by nearly half, which is very much a dramatic drop, which shows that students basically forgot all of the 16 words which they learned in terms of spelling, in terms of grammatical formation. So in the next slide, we did a correlation analysis. And basically, this shows us that even if the students did very well in the passage 1 to 4 in the gap fill test, this wasn't a predictor that they would do well in the delayed post test. So if they did well in the gap fill, it didn't mean they would do well in the delayed post test. So now let's look at some of the reasons for some of these results. So basically, perhaps there was a lack of repeated exposure. So we can talk about the forgetting curve effect, which obviously happened. So students encountered each synonym only once on a weekly basis. There was no review the following week. Yeah. So unless you do review, there is a tendency for students to forget what they learned. And also, the post-test was 5 weeks after the final passage. So the length of time can explain why students forgot these vocabulary words. Also, as I just mentioned, 5 weeks is a long time between the last passage and the delayed post-test. So I think students needed to review the words more, and their memory actually decayed over time, especially in terms of spelling. And if we go on to the next slide. So solutions. So if we want our students to do better in the reading section of a TOEFL test and learn vocabulary, we could employ techniques such as spaced repetition. So we can review learned synonyms before introducing new ones on a weekly basis. We could do cumulative mini exercises, for example, 4 new synonyms plus 2 old ones in the previous quizzes. And we can provide more varied context for each synonym. For example, after introducing the word, students could practice using it in different types of exercises, matching to a variety of synonyms, forming sentences, etc. Okay, so coming to our conclusions, multiple choice was obviously easier than gap fill for our students in this sample. And students interestingly prefer gap fill, even though they didn't do as well in these tests. There was a low retention rate in the gap fill in the delayed post test. And also we found that students' habits, learning words for synonyms and context, many students don't look up words. Yeah. And the teaching role, we need to focus more on meaning over form for retention, employ a variety of exercises like spaced repetition, and perhaps explicitly provide more teaching and review of these synonyms. So remember, we only did mini lessons just to see the effects these lessons would have on the retention of synonyms with the students. Okay, so we hope you enjoyed our presentation and it's useful. Here are references and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for watching.